The Clock That Struck 13, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where mystery unfolds in the quiet corners of English villages. I'm Connor, your narrator, and tonight I want to share with you a peculiar case involving murder, mathematics, and a clock that defied the laws of mechanics. This is the story of how Miss Marple unravelled one of the strangest deaths in Little Worthy's long and troubled history. Settle in with your tea or something stronger, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about locked room mysteries. Chapter 1. The Impossible Chime at 9:30. The November evening had settled over Little Worthy with the particular heaviness that precedes winter in the Cotswolds. Miss Jane Marple sat in the comfortable parlour of her temporary lodgings at the home of her old friend Margaret Thornbury, her knitting needles clicking with the rhythmic constancy of a pendulum. Mrs. Thornbury had succumbed to a particularly stubborn bout of bronchitis some 3 weeks prior, and Miss Marple had determined that her old companion deserved proper companionship during her recovery, rather than the attentions of paid nurses alone. The clicking of needles provided her with occupation while the household settled into its evening routines, and she had just completed the ribbing on what would become the third cardigan when the extraordinary event occurred. It was precisely 9:30 when the grandfather clock in the entrance hall began its chiming sequence. Miss Marple had grown accustomed to its regular mechanism over the weeks of her residence, and she could mark the passage of time with perfect accuracy by its resonant tones. 1 chime, 2 chimes, 3. She counted automatically, her hands continuing their work without interruption. Yet as the chimes progressed beyond the normal 9 that the hour demanded, she found herself pausing, her needle stilling mid-row. 7, 8, 9, 10. The sounds continued, each chime delivering an increasingly impossible succession of tones. 11, 12, and finally, impossibly, 13. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her keen mind already turning over the implications of what she had just heard. A clock striking 13 at 9:30 of the evening was as improbable as any event she had witnessed in her considerable experience of human nature and mechanical failure. The house seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of the final chime, and she could hear Mrs. Thornbury shifting in her upstairs bedroom, her bronchitis-weakened lungs producing a tentative cough. It was at this precise moment that a knock at the door shattered the evening's tranquillity. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of one accustomed to navigating a body that, while still serviceable, no longer moved with the ease of youth. She made her way to the entrance hall where the grandfather clock now stood in silent, almost accusatory repose. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and she opened the door to reveal the vicar of Little Worthy, Reverend Harold Whitmore, his usually composed face bearing an expression of considerable agitation. "Reverend Whitmore," she greeted him calmly, though noting the tremor in his hands and the way his eyes darted behind his spectacles. "Do come inside, though I must ask you to keep your voice low. Dear Margaret is resting." The vicar entered with the hurried movements of a man carrying news of catastrophic proportions. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "something quite dreadful has occurred at Hemsley Manor. Silas Hemsley has been found dead in his study, apparently shot through the heart, and the police are quite baffled because the study door was locked from the inside. The weapon cannot be located anywhere in the room. And the only peculiar element is that Beatrice Crane, the household maid, distinctly heard the grandfather clock chiming 13 times at the exact moment the shot was fired." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she habitually applied to any deviation from the expected pattern of events. "How very odd," she murmured, settling back into her chair and gesturing for the vicar to take a seat as well. "You said Beatrice heard the clock chiming 13 times. This would have been at what hour precisely?" "At 9:30, the vicar replied, "which is the hour I myself was walking past the manor gates on my evening constitutional. I heard both the extraordinary chiming sequence and what I can only describe as a sharp crack that I now believe to have been the fatal shot. The timing was simultaneous, Miss Marple, or near enough as to be virtually indistinguishable. And Silas Hemsley," she said thoughtfully, producing her knitting once more with the unconscious gesture of one who thinks more clearly while her hands remain occupied. "He was not universally beloved, if memory serves." The vicar's expression darkened considerably. Loved is scarcely the word one would apply to Silas Hemsley. The man was abrasive, acquisitive, and generally of the opinion that his considerable wealth entitled him to behave toward others with a contempt that bordered on cruelty. He had been estranged from his nephew Charles for nearly a decade, following some dispute regarding Charles's inheritance. There had also been recent difficulty with his household staff, particularly with regards to what he perceived as their insufficient efficiency. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her needles continuing their rhythmic work. "Tell me, Reverend, this extraordinary phenomenon with the clock. The grandfather clock at Hemsley Manor, is it maintained with the same regularity as most such instruments?" "As far as I'm aware, yes, though I cannot claim intimate knowledge of such matters. The clock has stood in that entrance hall for at least 60 years, perhaps longer. It has always been reliable, marking the hours with mechanical precision." "And yet tonight it chimed 13 times, Miss Marple observed. "A mechanical failure, certainly, but a most curious one. A clock does not simply decide to add an extra chime unless there is deliberate tampering or some extraordinary malfunction of its mechanism." "Exactly so," the vicar agreed, "which raises the question of whether the clock's peculiar behaviour might be connected to the circumstances of the murder itself. The police are treating the two events as separate phenomena, but I confess the simultaneity troubles me greatly." Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, her bright eyes fixed on the vicar's face with the intensity of someone whose deceptively gentle demeanour concealed a mind of formidable acuity. "Reverend Whitmore," she said carefully, "I find myself most curious about this locked room and the absent weapon. If Silas Hemsley was indeed shot through the heart, the murderer must have somehow removed the revolver from the study. Yet if the room was locked from the inside, such a removal would have required either the murderer's presence at the moment of death, or the prior removal of the weapon before the murder was committed. Both scenarios present considerable logical difficulties. The inspector who arrived from the county is a competent enough fellow," the vicar replied, "but he seems rather at a loss. The study window was sealed on the inside, no possible means of escape through the chimney, and Silas's own revolver was not the weapon used. The bullet remains lodged in his chest, and the gun that fired it remains unfound." Miss Marple rose once more and moved toward the great window that overlooked the village of Little Worthy, spread out below them in the gathering darkness. From her vantage point, she could see the lights of Hemsley Manor flickering in the distance, and she found herself contemplating the peculiar architecture of locked room mysteries and impossible crimes. "I wonder," she mused aloud, "whether the clock striking 13 is not meant to be interpreted as a mechanical failure at all, but rather as a deliberate signal of some kind. A clock that chimes 13 times is announcing that something impossible has occurred, something that defies the normal order of events. One might almost think someone intended to draw attention to the very impossibility that surrounds this murder." The vicar rose as well, his agitation seemingly increased by Miss Marple's observations, rather than diminished by them. "You think the clock was deliberately tampered with? In that case, who among the household would have both the knowledge and the access to accomplish such a feat?" Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. "That, Reverend, is precisely the sort of question that will require considerably more investigation before it can be answered with any certainty. But I confess that the coincidence troubles me. The clock strikes 13 at the precise moment Silas Hemsley is shot in a locked room. The murder weapon vanishes. The mechanisms of both the crime and the clock suggest a level of planning and technical knowledge that speaks to considerable premeditation. I have taken the liberty of informing Inspector Mercer that you're staying in the village," the vicar said hesitantly. "He expressed a desire to speak with you, given your well-known success with matters of this nature." "Did he indeed?" Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "How very flattering, though I am scarcely an official investigator. I am merely an elderly woman who has lived long enough to recognise certain patterns in human behaviour. Still, if the inspector wishes to consult with me, I should be happy to offer what modest observations I might make." Chapter 2. The Locked Study and the Vicar's Testimony. Inspector Mercer arrived at Mrs. Thornbury's residence the following morning, a man of perhaps 55 years with the weathered features and methodical demeanour typical of career policemen. He carried with him the particular air of someone who has encountered an anomaly that refuses to conform to his established procedures, and he seated himself across from Miss Marple in the parlour with the gratitude of a man who has discovered a potential lifeline in waters increasingly deep. "Miss Marple," he began, having dispensed with preliminary pleasantries in favour of direct address, "I understand from Reverend Whitmore that you possess considerable experience with circumstances that present considerable logical difficulty. I find myself in precisely such a situation." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea with the unhurried grace that characterised her movements. "Tell me, Inspector," she said gently, "about the locked study and the crime scene as you discovered it." The inspector consumed the tea gratefully before beginning his narrative. Silas Hemsley was discovered dead at approximately 10 o'clock yesterday evening by his valet, Thomas Brennan. The study door was found to be locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. The window was sealed, latched from the interior. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone unauthorized had gained access to the room. Yet Hemsley lay slumped in his leather desk chair with a bullet wound directly through his heart. And the weapon, Miss Marple prompted gently, vanished utterly. The revolver that fired the fatal shot was not present in the study. Hemsley's own weapon, a Webley kept in the desk drawer, was untouched. Ballistics confirms the bullet came from a different pistol entirely, likely a smaller caliber weapon. "How very remarkable," Miss Marple observed. "A murderer who locks the victim in a room and then removes the murder weapon before departing, all while leaving no signs of escape. One might almost believe in the existence of ghosts if one were inclined to such fanciful notions." The inspector grimaced at the observation. "You understand, then, why the matter troubles me so profoundly. The logical impossibility of the crime is exceeded only by the logical impossibility of the mechanical failure of the clock. Two impossible events occurring simultaneously suggests either an extraordinary coincidence or some deliberate orchestration of circumstances." Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care. "Tell me about this clock, Inspector. Not merely what it did, but the nature of its normal operation and any peculiarities you might have observed in its mechanism." "I took the liberty of having the clockmaker examine it," the inspector replied. "Thomas Graves, the local man who maintained such mechanisms throughout the county. His conclusions were decidedly inconclusive. The clock's mechanism appears to be in perfect working order. All components functioned exactly as designed during his inspection, yet there was evidence that someone had accessed the interior mechanism recently, perhaps within the past few days. The oil used to lubricate the works had been disturbed and fresh oil had been applied." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest at this detail. "Someone deliberately worked on the clock mechanism," she said thoughtfully. "Yet when the clockmaker examined it, he found no evidence of what might cause it to chime 13 times. The tampering was carefully concealed, I suspect." "Exactly so," the inspector agreed, "which raises the obvious question of why one would tamper with a clock to cause it to strike 13 at a specific hour, if not to create some sort of distraction or to cover for some other activity." Miss Marple rose and made her way to the window once more, her mind clearly engaged in the systematic ordering of evidence and probability. "Inspector," she said without turning from her observation of the village beyond, "I wonder whether you might describe for me the exact sequence of events as they are understood by those who were present in the household at the time of the murder." The inspector consulted his notebook. Beatrice Crane, the maid, was in the kitchen preparing evening tea at approximately 9:30. She heard the clock chiming its strange sequence, and immediately afterward heard what she describes as a sharp crack, which she believes to have been the sound of the revolver. She did not investigate immediately, as the household staff had been instructed not to disturb Hemsley when he was in his study. It was not until Thomas Brennan, the valet, attempted to serve Hemsley his evening brandy at 10 o'clock that the body was discovered. "And where was Charles Hemsley, the nephew, at this time?" Miss Marple asked, turning back to face the inspector. "At his residence in the village, approximately a mile from the manor. He claims to have been reading alone and provides no witnesses to corroborate his whereabouts." "How very convenient," Miss Marple observed. "A man estranged from his uncle over matters of inheritance chooses the precise moment of his uncle's death to engage in solitary activities. The inspector's own suspicions must naturally have been directed toward Charles." "They were," the inspector admitted, "yet I can find no evidence that Charles Hemsley possessed access to the manor at the time of the murder. The household staff attest that he did not enter by any known means. The doors were secured, the windows undisturbed." Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her knitting, the needles moving with their characteristic rhythm as she contemplated the assembled facts. "Tell me about the relationship between Silas and Charles," she said presently. "What precisely was the nature of their estrangement?" The inspector shifted in his chair, consulting his notes with evident reluctance. "Some 10 years ago, Charles was engaged to a young woman named Margaret Ashworth. The engagement was broken at Silas's insistence, though the precise grounds for his objection were never made public. Charles removed himself from the household in protest, and the two have been estranged ever since. More recently, Silas indicated his intention to change his will, removing Charles as his primary beneficiary in favour of a distant charitable concern. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily at this revelation. A broken engagement at the uncle's insistence, she mused aloud. In my experience, such circumstances often conceal considerably more than they initially reveal. What became of the young woman, Margaret Ashworth? She married another man, the inspector replied. Though the marriage appears to have been an unhappy one, she's lived in the village as the wife of Jonathan Hartley, a merchant of modest means. The marriage has no children and is widely understood to be a union of convenience rather than affection. Miss Marple's expression suggested she found this detail particularly significant. And Silas Hemsley, she asked carefully, did he have strong opinions regarding the appropriateness of this marriage, as he apparently did regarding Charles's engagement? I could not say with certainty, the inspector replied. The woman has never been a resident of the manor, and there is no record of particular conflict between Silas and Jonathan Hartley. Yet it was precisely at the time of Margaret Ashworth's marriage to Hartley that Silas's treatment of his nephew became noticeably colder. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely and fixed the inspector with the full intensity of her gaze. Inspector, she said with the careful precision that marked her most significant observations, I believe you may find that the mysteries of this case extend considerably deeper into the village's history than the events of yesterday evening alone. A young woman engaged to the nephew of a wealthy man, the engagement broken by the uncle's insistence, followed some time later by her marriage to another man of reduced circumstances. These are not random occurrences. They suggest deliberate choices and possible motivations that might illuminate not only the murder of Silas Hemsley, but also the curious behaviour of the manor's clock. Chapter 3. The Apprentice Clockmaker's Revelation. It was on the afternoon of the second day following Silas Hemsley's death that Miss Marple requested an interview with Thomas Graves, the clockmaker. Inspector Mercer, though initially sceptical of the necessity for such a conversation, arranged the meeting with sufficient grace, and the elderly craftsman arrived at Mrs. Thornbury's residence carrying his tools and his evident confusion regarding why a village woman of Miss Marple's advanced years should wish to consult him regarding matters of mechanical complexity. Mr. Graves, Miss Marple greeted him with the warmth she extended to all who possessed genuine expertise in their chosen field. I understand you have maintained the grandfather clock at Hemsley Manor for these many years? The clockmaker nodded, his weathered hands moving with the nervous energy typical of men uncomfortable in social situations. Some 30 years now, Miss Marple. That clock has been my responsibility since I established my business in Littleworthy. Reliable mechanism it is, or was until this recent business, and you examined it following the murder, Miss Marple continued. Moving toward the tea service with the offer of refreshment, your findings suggested that someone had tampered with its interior mechanism. That they had, Graves agreed, accepting the offered cup with visible relief. The mechanism itself appears undamaged, but the oil had been disturbed and reapplied with fresh lubricant. Someone with knowledge of horological principles had accessed the interior, though to what purpose I cannot fathom. Miss Marple settled herself across from him with her knitting, an action that seemed to put the craftsman somewhat at ease. Mr. Graves, she said thoughtfully, I wonder whether you might explain to me the precise mechanics by which a clock comes to strike a particular number of chimes. Is it a matter of mechanical escapement, or is there some other principle at work? The clockmaker's expression shifted toward the more confident demeanour he adopted when discussing his craft. The striking mechanism, Miss Marple, operates through a series of cams and pins arranged on a rotating drum. As the drum rotates, the pins engage a lever mechanism that controls the hammer that strikes the bell. The number of times the bell is struck is determined by the number of pins and their precise arrangement on the drum. So, Miss Marple asked carefully, if one wished to cause a clock to strike 13 times instead of 9, one would need to alter the arrangement of pins on this drum. Precisely so, Graves confirmed, though such an alteration would be immediately obvious to anyone examining the mechanism. One cannot simply add an extra pin without evidence of the modification being apparent to any experienced craftsman. And yet you found no evidence of such modification when you examined the clock following the murder, Miss Marple observed. That is correct, Graves replied. his evident puzzlement increasing. The drum appeared entirely unaltered, yet clearly the mechanism somehow produced 13 chimes. I'm at a loss to explain the phenomenon. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic work as she turned this puzzle over in her mind. "Mr. Graves," she said presently, "I wonder whether you might have an apprentice or an assistant, someone younger, perhaps, with the manual dexterity required to work on such delicate mechanisms under instruction." The clockmaker nodded slowly. "My apprentice, David Hartley, works with me on various projects. The boy is quite skilled considering his age and experience. Reliable enough in most matters, though he has been noticeably distracted these past weeks." "David Hartley," Miss Marple repeated with interest. "I wonder whether this might be the same Hartley family that owns the merchant's business in the village." "The same," Graves confirmed with evident reluctance, as though the connection brought with it information he would have preferred not to provide. "David is the son of Jonathan Hartley and his wife Margaret. The boy is ambitious, I'll give him that, and his father's business prospects being what they are, I suspect young David sees his apprenticeship with me as a pathway to more promising prospects." Miss Marple set down her knitting, giving the clockmaker her full attention. "And Margaret Hartley," she said carefully, "would that be the Margaret Ashworth who was previously engaged to Charles Hemsley?" Graves nodded, understanding immediately that his conversation with Miss Marple had moved into territory considerably more delicate than mechanical matters. The very same. A complicated business, that. The engagement was broken at Silas Hemsley's insistence, though whether for legitimate reasons or through some darker motivation I could not say. Whatever the truth of the matter, Margaret married Jonathan Hartley soon after, and they have resided in the village these 10 years or more. "And David," Miss Marple pressed gently, "how long has he been apprenticed to you?" "Some 3 years now," Graves replied. "The boy has genuine talent for the craft, though lately he has seemed troubled. I attributed it to youthful romantic entanglement. As such, matters often occupy the minds of young people to the exclusion of more practical concerns." Miss Marple rose and moved once more to the window, her expression suggesting she was examining some problem of considerable complexity in her mind. "Mr. Graves," she said without turning, "I wonder whether you would be willing to allow me to examine your tools and supplies. Particularly, I'm curious about whether you possess the knowledge to create a secondary mechanism within the grandfather clock, one that might cause it to strike 13 under specific circumstances while remaining invisible to routine inspection." The clockmaker's face paled slightly at this suggestion. "You think young David might have tampered with the clock? But why on earth would he engage in such an act?" "That, Mr. Graves, is precisely what I intend to determine," Miss Marple replied, turning to face him with the intensity of someone whose deceptively gentle demeanour concealed a mind of formidable acuity. "For I suspect that the clock striking 13 at the moment of Silas Hemsley's death was not a random mechanical failure at all, but rather a carefully planned distraction designed to cover for circumstances considerably more complex than anyone has yet considered." Chapter 4. The Will That Changed with the Seasons. Inspector Mercer's initial scepticism regarding Miss Marple's interest in the apprentice clockmaker gave way to considerable curiosity once her observations regarding possible manipulation of the clock's mechanism were explained. He arranged for David Hartley to be brought in for formal questioning, though the young man's protestations of innocence and complete absence of any criminal record made it difficult to press charges without considerably more evidence. It was through a conversation with solicitor Edward Ashford that Miss Marple discovered the truly significant detail that would transform the case from one of simple murder into something considerably more elaborate. Ashford maintained the legal affairs of several prominent village families, including that of Silas Hemsley, and he proved remarkably forthcoming once Inspector Mercer had explained the investigative necessity for such disclosure. "Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple addressed the solicitor during their meeting in his office, "I understand that Silas Hemsley's will underwent certain modifications in the period preceding his death." The solicitor exchanged a glance with the inspector before responding. "That information is technically confidential, though given the circumstances, I suppose there is little harm in disclosure. Yes, Hemsley modified his will on several occasions over the past decade. Initially, Charles Hemsley was his principal beneficiary, but following their estrangement, Silas expressed intention to alter the document entirely." "And did he actually execute these alterations?" Miss Marple asked carefully, "or did the matter remain one of intention rather than legal action?" The solicitor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "The situation is somewhat complicated. Silas prepared a new will approximately 18 months ago, designating his estate to be divided among several charitable organisations. However, he never actually executed this new document. He died, technically, with his previous will still in effect. The older will, drawn up some 5 years prior, designated Charles Hemsley as principal beneficiary, with secondary bequests to various household staff members. Miss Marple's expression suggested she found this detail particularly significant. So Silas Hemsley died intestate with regard to his most recent intentions, she said thoughtfully. The legal effect being that Charles Hemsley, despite their estrangement and Silas's stated desire to disinherit him, inherits the substantial portion of the estate. That is precisely the situation, Ashford confirmed, his evident discomfort suggesting this paradox had troubled him as well. Silas was quite emphatic about his desire to alter his will, yet he seemed to lack the final determination necessary to execute the new document. He was a man prone to changing his mind, and I suspect he believed there would always be time to make the modification official. Miss Marple rose from her chair and began to pace the solicitor's office, her mind clearly engaged with the puzzle. And this previous will, the one executed 5 years prior, was there any particular reason Silas made provisions for household staff at that time? Ashford consulted his files, a habit that suggested he had considered this matter previously. There was a notation regarding recent employment and faithful service. Hemsley seemed to regard certain staff members as worthy of reward, particularly a long-time housekeeper named Mrs. Eleanor Wickham, who served the family for nearly 40 years. Eleanor Wickham, Miss Marple repeated, a name that seemed to trigger a chain of associations in her mind. A woman of what age, approximately? 70 or thereabouts, Ashford replied. She retired from active service some 5 years ago, shortly before Hemsley executed the will that named her as a beneficiary. Miss Marple paused in her pacing, her eyes narrowing with sudden comprehension. And did Mrs. Wickham have any close family connections in the village? Any relatives or persons with whom she maintained a particular affinity? I could not say with certainty, Ashford replied, though I believe she had a niece who resided in Little Worthy. Whether any legal relationship existed between them, I cannot determine from my records alone. Miss Marple returned to her chair with the expression of someone who has suddenly perceived the architecture underlying what had previously appeared to be a random arrangement of facts. Inspector, she said, turning toward Mercer with evident purpose, I wonder whether you might investigate the precise relationship between Mrs. Eleanor Wickham and Margaret Hartley. I believe you may find that they are considerably more closely connected than the parish records would initially suggest. Chapter 5. A Marriage Concealed in Silence. The investigation into the connection between Eleanor Wickham and Margaret Hartley revealed layers of family history that had been deliberately obscured by the passage of time and the enforced silence of those involved. Eleanor Wickham was indeed Margaret's maternal aunt, but the relationship went considerably deeper than simple family connection. According to records obtained through the local vicar, Eleanor had served as Margaret's legal guardian following the death of Margaret's parents some 20 years prior. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested an interview with Margaret Hartley herself, a meeting that took place in the parlour of the Hartley residence, with Jonathan Hartley himself absent on business in a neighbouring county. Margaret was a woman of perhaps 40 years, still bearing traces of the considerable beauty that must have charactered her youth, though her features carried the particular weight of someone who had lived a life considerably more constrained than her circumstances would appear to warrant. Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marple began with the gentleness that characterised her approach to sensitive matters, I find myself curious about certain aspects of your family history, particularly regarding your relationship to your Aunt Eleanor and the circumstances surrounding your engagement to Charles Hemsley. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea for her guest, a nervous gesture that suggested the topic held considerable emotional significance. That was a very long time ago, Miss Marple. I've endeavoured not to dwell on it, and yet the circumstances of your engagement's termination and your subsequent marriage to Jonathan Hartley appear to have been connected to Silas Hemsley's intervention, Miss Marple observed gently, a young woman engaged to a man whom she clearly cared for, the engagement broken by a relative of that man, and then a marriage to another gentleman arranged, if I am not mistaken, with some considerable haste. Margaret set down the teapot with a gesture of resignation, as though she had been carrying a burden too heavy to bear for far too long and found some relief in the prospect of finally setting it down. You are perceptive, Miss Marple. The engagement to Charles was genuine, I cared deeply for him, but Silas Hemsley discovered something about my family's history, something that he believed would bring scandal upon his household if it became known. He demanded that I end the engagement or face exposure of this secret. And what secret was that? Miss Marple asked, though I suspect I have begun to discern its nature. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady as she spoke. My parents were not married to each other when I was born. They later married, of course, once my father's prior marriage was dissolved, but there was a period during which I was illegitimate. It was a scandal by the standards of that time, particularly given my father's prominence in the district. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the calm of one who had encountered human fallibility in all its manifestations. And Silas Hemsley, she said thoughtfully, deemed this taint sufficient grounds to break your engagement to Charles. A curious position for a man to take, given that such matters are far from uncommon in English families. Margaret looked up from her tea with evident surprise at Miss Marple's measured response. You do not condemn me, Miss Marple? My dear Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marple replied with warmth, I have lived long enough to recognise that legitimate and illegitimate births are theological concepts of considerably less significance than the actual quality of a person's character and conduct. Silas Hemsley's objection was not truly moral in nature, I suspect, but rather a manifestation of his appetite for control. He exercised his disapproval over you because he possessed the power to do so, and because the breaking of your engagement would affect some other purpose in his mind. Margaret's face paled at this observation. How could you possibly know such a thing? Because, Miss Marple said carefully, I've come to suspect that Charles Hemsley and you were not as acceptable a match to Silas as they might initially appear. Charles, if I am not mistaken, was already married at the time of your engagement. The shock that registered on Margaret's face was entirely genuine, suggesting that this particular truth had been concealed even from her. How could you possibly know that? Margaret whispered. Because, Miss Marple replied, I am informed that Reverend Whitmore conducted a marriage ceremony approximately 10 days before your engagement to Charles was announced. A confidential ceremony, I believe, with no witnesses other than the vicar and the bride and groom. Charles Hemsley and you, I presume, though the marriage was kept secret due to Silas's known opposition to any match that he had not personally approved. Margaret's hands covered her face as the emotional weight of this recognition seemed to overwhelm her. How long have you known this? Only since yesterday, Miss Marple assured her gently. But it explains a great deal regarding the events that followed. Your marriage to Charles could not be revealed without incurring Silas's wrath. The secret marriage was therefore dissolved through legal means, though the genuine emotional connection between you and Charles remained. Your subsequent marriage to Jonathan Hartley was a convenient cover for a relationship that could not be publicly acknowledged. And your Aunt Eleanor, Miss Marple continued with evident sympathy, she was party to this secret, which is why she remained in Silas Hemsley's household, long after her active years should have permitted her retirement. She was, in essence, Silas's prisoner, bound by her knowledge of the secret that could destroy both you and Charles if revealed. Margaret nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. Aunt Eleanor devoted her entire life to protecting me and my marriage to Charles. We were not allowed to see each other openly, but we corresponded through coded messages hidden in Aunt Eleanor's knitting, a method that seemed somehow appropriate given her profession. Aunt Eleanor eventually retired 5 years ago, and Silas settled a pension on her in recognition of her years of service. But the weight of what she knew, of what she had sacrificed, was always apparent. Chapter 6. The Clockmaker and the Hidden Marriage. It was through patient investigation and careful attention to the testimony of household staff that Inspector Mercer and Miss Marple gradually pieced together the events that had led to Silas Hemsley's death. David Hartley, the clockmaker's apprentice and Margaret's own son, had grown progressively more aware of the injustice that his family had endured through Silas Hemsley's tyrannical control. The knowledge that his mother and biological father had been forced into a false marriage with Jonathan Hartley while maintaining a secret legal marriage to Charles, that his grandmother Eleanor had sacrificed her entire life to protect this secret, had enraged the young man with the particular fury that only an idealistic youth can experience when confronted with institutional cruelty. David had approached the clock mechanism not out of any desire for violence, but rather as a young man seeking to create a distraction that would allow his grandmother's letters to be removed from Silas Hemsley's private safe, The letters were the only remaining evidence of the secret marriage between Charles and Margaret, documents that Silas had used as leverage to maintain his control over the household. It was young David who had altered the grandfather clock mechanism, creating a secondary arrangement of pins and levers that would cause it to strike 13 at precisely 9:30 on the evening of the murder. He had worked with meticulous care to ensure that no evidence of the modification would remain visible to casual inspection. He had then approached his biological father, Charles, with information regarding the distraction and his plan to break into Silas's study, while the household's attention was occupied by the extraordinary chiming sequence. But Charles Hemsley, faced with the opportunity to recover the documents that had enslaved his family for a decade, made the choice that transformed youthful rebellion into murder. Confronted by his uncle in the study while searching for the letters, Silas had attempted to call for help. Charles had retrieved a revolver from the cabinet, a weapon kept hidden in the manor for nearly a year in anticipation of some future necessity. The shot that killed Silas had been fired in desperation rather than premeditation, yet desperation does not diminish the fact of murder. It was the removal of the weapon that provided the crucial evidence of Charles's guilt. Rather than leaving the revolver in the study, Charles had passed it through the door to young David, who stood in the corridor beyond. David had then concealed the weapon within the grandfather clock itself, a hiding place that seemed secure precisely because the clock was so frequently examined without revealing its interior mechanisms to casual observation. Chapter 7: The Grocer's False Measures and the Truth's Geometry. It was during a conversation with Mrs. Thornbury, as her bronchitis improved sufficiently to permit her return to normal consciousness and engagement with the events unfolding in the village, that Miss Marple made the observation that would ultimately crack the case entirely. Mrs. Thornbury had mentioned in passing that the local grocer, a man named Terence Blackwell, had been the subject of some complaint from the village regarding his scales and measures. "The grocer has been cheating the village for years," Mrs. Thornbury explained, with the righteous indignation of someone who has been personally affected by the deception. "The scales in his shop have been systematically tampered with, weighing items as lighter than they actually are, thereby reducing the quantity customers receive while charging full price. The discrepancy is small enough that most people do not notice it in any single transaction, but over time the cumulative effect is considerable theft." Miss Marple set down her knitting needles with unusual deliberation, her mind clearly engaged with the implications of this information. "A man who tampers with scales and measures to achieve his purposes through small, incremental deceptions," she murmured thoughtfully, a parallel that proves most illuminating. "I do not understand your meaning, Jane," Mrs. Thornbury replied with evident confusion. "Neither did I," Miss Marple explained, "until this very moment. You see, my dear Margaret, the clock striking 13 is precisely analogous to Blackwell's false scales. A small deviation from the expected, a mechanical impossibility that reveals itself only because the deviation is so complete as to become obvious. Yet the purpose of the false scales is to conceal a more profound crime through incremental variation from the truth. One weight is false, creating a cascade of dishonesty that extends throughout the grocer's business operations. Similarly, the clock striking 13 is not meant to hide a murder, but to advertise it, to proclaim its own impossibility so loudly that everyone's attention is drawn to the mechanism of the crime rather than to the circumstances that made the crime necessary. The clock announces that something impossible has occurred because the murder itself was meant to seem impossible." Miss Marple rose from her chair and began to pace the room with the energy of someone whose mind has suddenly achieved clarity regarding a problem that has long troubled her. The locked room murder, the absent weapon, the mysterious clock, all of these elements were designed to suggest the absolute impossibility of the crime, thereby directing suspicion toward the mechanical rather than the human. Yet a locked room is only impossible if one assumes that the murderer was not present at the moment of death, that the weapon was not removed by human hands immediately following the shot. What Charles Hemsley created was not an impossible murder, but rather a perfectly logical crime disguised through the language of impossibility. By making the circumstance so impossible as to appear theatrical, he created a mask behind which the actual motive could hide, and the motive, dear Margaret, was not love or passion or even desperation, but rather justice deferred by a decade. Chapter 8: The Second Death and the Confession That Could Not Be Avoided. The arrest of Charles Hemsley and the subsequent discovery of the revolver, hidden within the grandfather clock mechanism, seemed to bring the matter to a close. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by an element of the case that remained unresolved. Thomas Graves, the clockmaker, had been present at the examination of the clock when David Hartley's modifications were discovered. The young man had confessed immediately upon confronting the evidence, weeping as he explained his role in altering the mechanism and his initial intention that the distraction would serve only to allow his grandmother's letters to be recovered. But Graves's demeanour during this examination had struck Miss Marple as suggesting knowledge beyond what the clockmaker had publicly acknowledged. When she requested a final interview with the elderly craftsman, he agreed with a resignation that suggested he had been expecting such a request and had already determined his response to any questions she might pose. "Mr. Graves," Miss Marple addressed him once they were seated in the privacy of her temporary residence at Mrs. Thornbury's home, "I find myself curious about your relationship to the Hartley family. Your apprentice is their son, and yet your connection to the household seems to extend considerably deeper than simple employment arrangements would warrant." The clockmaker aged visibly before her eyes, as though the question itself had lifted a burden that his shoulders had been carrying for years. "Eleanor Wickham was my sister, Miss Marple, my older sister, whom I had not seen for nearly 40 years until this business brought her name once more into association with my own. We were separated when we were very young, parted by circumstances beyond our control. She went into service, and I apprenticed myself to a craftsman in a neighbouring county. When I returned to Little Worthy as an established tradesman, I found that she was already deeply embedded in the Hemsley household, and that Silas's tyranny had left her no avenue of escape. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with careful attention. And when you discovered that your sister had been forced to sacrifice her entire life to protect a secret that your nephew David and his family wished to expose, you found yourself torn between the claim of family loyalty and the claims of justice and righteousness." Graves nodded slowly. "When David came to me with his plan to alter the clock mechanism, he did not fully explain his intentions. I believed him when he said the distraction was meant only to recover certain documents from Silas's study. I helped him modify the clock mechanism because I believed in the justice of his cause. Yet I sensed immediately upon hearing the shot fired that something more serious had occurred, that Charles Hemsley had chosen violence where only theft had been intended." "And you remained silent," Miss Marple said quietly, "allowing your nephew and his father to be arrested when you possessed knowledge that might have explained the circumstances of the murder and the true motive behind it." "I could not bring myself to betray my sister's memory," Graves replied with evident anguish. "Eleanor had sacrificed everything to protect her family's secrets, to reveal the truth of her situation, of the hidden marriage between Charles and Margaret, of the decades of exploitation that Silas Hemsley had inflicted upon her, seemed somehow to betray the very sacrifice she had made." "Yet truth, Mr. Graves," Miss Marple observed with characteristic gentleness, "however painful, possesses a power to transform suffering into something that might ultimately be meaningful. Eleanor Wickham's sacrifice was made in silence because she had no other choice. But silence perpetuated now, in the aftermath of her ordeal's revelation, would serve only to compound the injustice that she endured. It was in the early hours of the following morning that Thomas Graves was discovered dead in his workshop, slumped over his workbench with an empty bottle of laudanum beside his trembling hands. The suicide note, found among his papers, contained a brief confession regarding his assistance in altering the grandfather clock and an explanation of his knowledge regarding the true circumstances of Silas Hemsley's death. The note was addressed to Inspector Mercer and contained within it the revelation that would finally allow Miss Marple to bring the entire tangled case to resolution. Chapter 9. The Will That Returned to Its Beginning. With both Charles Hemsley and young David Hartley facing serious criminal charges, and Thomas Graves's suicide providing a final piece of testimony regarding the premeditation behind the clock's alteration, the case seemed destined to proceed toward trial and formal adjudication. Yet Miss Marple found herself reflecting that the law's methods of achieving closure often obscured rather than illuminated the deeper truths that motivated human action. It was at her insistence that Inspector Mercer agreed to one final meeting in the parlour of Mrs. Thornbury's residence, a gathering that included Charles Hemsley himself, brought under police custody, alongside Margaret Hartley, Eleanor Wickham, and Edward Ashford, the solicitor who had maintained the legal affairs of Silas's household. "I've asked you all to gather," Miss Marple explained, her knitting set aside in favour of the gravity that the occasion demanded, "because I believe that the resolution of this matter extends considerably beyond the simple facts of Silas Hemsley's murder. A man is dead, certainly, and his death was accomplished through the application of criminal violence. Yet the crime itself was born from injustice that operated with perfect legality within our social structures for the better part of a decade. Charles Hemsley, Miss Marple addressed the prisoner directly, you married Margaret Ashworth in secret because you recognised that Silas's objection was not moral in nature, but rather an expression of his appetite for control. You endured a decade of separation from your wife. Communication limited to coded messages hidden in your aunt's knitting. You accepted the humiliation of your own disinheritance as preferable to the exposure of your marriage and the scandal that would have affected not only yourself but the woman you loved and the family that had sheltered your secret. When the opportunity presented itself, when young David revealed the clock mechanism's alteration and provided a means by which the documents proving your marriage might be recovered from Silas's private safe, you made the choice that transformed your long suffering into an act of violence. That choice was not made lightly. It was made in desperation, in the moment of discovery by a man you regarded as your mortal enemy. Yet I wonder whether you have fully considered the question of what you intended to accomplish through Silas's death. The documents you sought would have provided evidence of your marriage, but they would have changed nothing regarding your legal position or Margaret's. Eleanor Wickham's pension secured in Silas's will, executed 5 years ago, would have been secure regardless of whether Silas lived or died. The only thing accomplished by his murder was to ensure that your own imprisonment was virtually certain and that the scandal you sought to conceal would become public knowledge in the most dramatic fashion possible. Charles looked away from Miss Marple's gaze, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her observations. I wanted him dead, he said quietly. I have wanted him dead for 10 years. Every year that Margaret and I were separated, every communication through coded messages, every knowing glance we exchanged in public while pretending to be strangers, all of it accumulated into a hatred so profound that when the opportunity came, the choice seemed inevitable. And young David, Miss Marple continued, turning her attention to the matter of Charles's son, what was his motivation in creating the clock mechanism's alteration? David acted out of love for his grandmother and what he perceived as righteous indignation at his family's mistreatment. Yet David must now face the knowledge that his actions, undertaken with noble intent, have resulted in his father's imprisonment for murder. Eleanor Wickham rose from her chair at this point, her aged frame carrying a dignity that suggested years of enforced silence had left her capacity for bearing witness to truth fundamentally intact. Miss Marple, she said quietly, you have suggested that my sacrifice was meaningless, that truth perpetuated now would serve some purpose that silence could not achieve. I wonder whether you might elaborate on that suggestion. Miss Marple turned toward the elderly woman with evident respect. Your sacrifice, Mrs. Wickham, was undertaken in silence and received no recognition or validation from those who benefited from it. You protected your niece's marriage and your nephew's relationship with his wife through decades of service to a man who exploited that sacrifice without acknowledging its cost. You accepted a pension in return for your silence, accepting your exile from the family you loved as the price of their safety and happiness. But silence transforms sacrifice into invisible suffering. If your story were known, if the circumstances of your ordeal were understood, then your sacrifice would become a testimony to the possibility of human love and loyalty in the face of institutional cruelty. That transformation would not restore the years you lost or undo the injustices you endured, but it would grant meaning to your suffering by allowing it to illuminate the darkness within which such cruelties are ordinarily concealed. Chapter 10. The clock's final chime and the question of justice deferred. In the weeks that followed the arrest of Charles Hemsley and the revelation of the hidden marriage between Charles and Margaret, little Worthy experienced the particular upheaval that such exposure inevitably produced. The scandal that Charles had sought to conceal for a decade became the subject of village conversation, analysed and reanalysed in drawing rooms and village shops with the thoroughness that small communities habitually brought to such matters. Yet what emerged from this public examination was not the condemnation that Charles had feared, but rather a gradual recognition that the injustice inflicted upon the family by Silas Hemsley's tyranny had been considerable, and the rebellion that resulted from it, however violent its ultimate manifestation, carried within it an element of tragic nobility. It was through Edward Ashford's intervention that the matter of Silas Hemsley's will, was finally resolved in a manner that would have seemed impossible to imagine when Silas lived. Although Charles's conviction for his uncle's murder would ordinarily have rendered him ineligible to inherit any portion of Silas's estate, the unusual circumstances of the case and the evident sympathy for Charles's situation that had emerged in both judicial and public opinion created an opportunity for legal and moral compromise. The will was modified through the application of principles of equity and justice that seemed to recognise that Silas's own actions, through his refusal to execute the new will that would have disinherited Charles, had created the very circumstance that resulted in his death. The estate was ultimately divided among Charles, as the surviving beneficiary of the prior will, the charitable organisations that Silas had intended to designate in his final testament, and provisions established for Eleanor Wickham that would ensure her comfortable retirement and recognition of her years of sacrifice. The grandfather clock at Hemsley Manor was never entirely repaired. The mechanism that young David Hartley had modified was left within it, a ghost in the machine that would forever cause the instrument to chime 13 times whenever the hour of 9:30 arrived. Visitors to the manor who heard the 13 chimes asked questions, and those questions led inevitably to explanations of the family's tragic history, the hidden marriage, the decade of separation, and the murder that had resulted from decades of accumulated injustice. It was on an evening in late autumn, some 4 months following Silas Hemsley's death, that Miss Marple received a visitor at Mrs. Thornbury's residence. Margaret Hartley had come to say goodbye as she and Charles and young David were emigrating to Canada, seeking in that distant land an opportunity to build a new life unburdened by the weight of English scandal and the legal machinery that had consumed so much of their recent experience. "Miss Marple," Margaret said as she took her leave, "I wanted to thank you for recognising the truth of our situation and for insisting that the circumstances of my family's ordeal be made public. I confess I did not understand at the time how exposure could serve our interests. I believed, like Charles, that silence was preferable to revelation. But you were correct. The truth, however painful, transformed my suffering into something that meant something." Miss Marple embraced the younger woman with the warmth she extended to all who had endured profound injustice and emerged from that suffering with their capacity for love and loyalty intact. "Truth and justice," Miss Marple said gently, "are not always the same thing, but when human beings are willing to face truth, however difficult, it creates the possibility of genuine justice, something considerably more profound than the law's mechanical application of punishment and imprisonment." As Margaret departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as she contemplated the strange case that had brought her to Little Worthy. A clock that chimed 13 times, a locked room murder where the lock had concealed rather than protected, a family destroyed by the weight of secrets that accumulated across a decade. All of it resolved through the simple recognition that impossibility, when examined with sufficient care, often reveals itself to be merely an elaborate disguise for the possible. The case of the clock that struck 13 remained one of Miss Marple's most unusual investigations, and she would reflect upon it for years to come, remembering particularly Eleanor Wickham's quiet dignity and the recognition that human suffering, when finally acknowledged and given meaning through its honest examination, possesses a transformative power that mere concealment can never achieve. The evening storm that had marked the night of Silas Hemsley's murder was ultimately eclipsed by the quiet clarity of a woman who had lived long enough to recognise that in the village of human experience, the greatest mysteries are often those we construct ourselves to hide the simpler truths that we find too difficult to face. And so ends the story of the clock that struck 13, as told by Connor from Velvet Clues, a reminder that murder, however elaborate its commission, remains merely a variation on the endless human struggle between truth and the comfortable darkness of concealment. Good night, and thank you for joining Miss Marple once more in the mysteries of an English village where even the mechanical instruments of time itself bear witness to the consequences of human cruelty and the redemptive power of love deferred but never extinguished.